Hello, and welcome to Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning, a higher education podcast from the Center for Teaching and Learning at Columbia University. I'm Amanda Irvin, the Center's Executive Director. In this podcast series, we explore dead ideas in teaching and learning, beliefs that, despite being untrue, continue to shape educational systems and practices. These outdated notions, as Diane Pike described, perpetuate the tyranny of dead ideas. Join us as we challenge these misconceptions and explore innovative approaches to higher education. Welcome, everyone. I'm speaking today with Karen Costa. Karen Costa is a faculty development facilitator, adjunct faculty, and author who supports educators with implementing simple and sustainable teaching strategies. Her first book, 99 Tips for Creating Simple and Sustainable Educational Videos, was released in 2020. Her second book, An Educator's Guide to ADHD, is forthcoming in January 2026. You can learn more about her work at 100faculty.com. Karen lives in Massachusetts with her family. Karen, welcome to our Dead Ideas podcast. I'm so happy that you're joining us today.
Thank you. I have been looking forward to this.
Me too. So I'll set the stage a little bit for our listeners, and then we will dive into our conversation. You and I connected recently about your new book, An Educator's Guide to ADHD, which I read a few days ago. And it's great. And I'm so happy that it's out in the world. And one of the central aims of the book is, and this is my understanding, so you are welcome to correct me about the central aims of your own book. But it seemed to me that one of the central aims of the book, especially in part one, is to unpack and debunk some enduring ideas about ADHD. Primary among them is that ADHD is an attention deficit disorder, and you instead reframe it as a natural variation of being in the world, which is to be celebrated. I'm hoping that we can talk about that today, and also particularly how and why this dead idea about ADHD persists in higher education and the implications that we might, as educators or educational developers, the implications that it might have for reframing ADHD for teaching and learning in higher ed. So maybe that's a good place for us to start. Simple questions, easy softball things at the very beginning. Could you talk a little bit about the reframing you do in the book to help readers see ADHD as another way of being in the world? And then by extension, helping instructors see students with ADHD as simply another way of approaching learning and contributing to a classroom. And we can take this in two parts if you want to.
Sure. First of all, I'm really glad that you resonated with that frame. That sort of evolved over several drafts, to say the least, in that I was having to work through a lot of my own internalized ableism and old/dead ideas about ADHD before I really arrived at that clear structure of the first half of the book is telling the truth of the ADHD experience. And then the second half of the book is, now that we know this, now that we've changed our mindsets about ADHD, what does that look like in the classroom? So I'm really glad to hear that you got that. If I had only jumped to practical strategies, I know that there are just so many misconceptions about ADHD that those would therefore be less effective and in some cases potentially harmful to our ADHD students. So it was really important for me that the first half of the book did the work of reframing, which was something I was very much, going through myself as I wrote it.
You have a wonderful direct way of speaking to your readers, which I loved. But you even said, I know you're tempted to skip to the second portion of this book.
I believe you. I've seen this thing 7,000 times at this point, so I should have it memorized, but I don't. So yeah, that's really important, because if you have that deficit-based mindset, which we have all been taught, myself included, if you still have that woven into your brain, when you get to the practical strategies, they're simply not going to be as effective, and they're, again, going to have that potential for harm. One of the harms is let me make my ADHD students, let me try to get them to act like neurotypical students. That's a very common thing that we see. Whereas if you understand ADHD in this completely different way through the neurodiversity framework, that will change everything. That alone will change everything. And then the practical strategies will really just flow from that shift in mindset. So I'm glad I said that. And it really is, it's really so important. If you only read, one part of the book, read the first half and everything else will flow from that. So the reframe is to use the neurodiversity paradigm, which says that ADHD is part of what I call the vast variety of ways of being of neurotypes in the human experience. And that is in contrast to the deficit-based approach. The term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, some clinicians, probably with very good intentions, have argued with me that is not a deficit-based frame. It actually does have the word deficit in the diagnosis. So I would disagree there. And the argument is that not only is that harmful to people, but it is a barrier to learning. And wildly inaccurate. ADHD is not a deficit of attention. In many cases, quite the opposite. The other frame that we then see, sort of the pendulum swings back in the opposite direction, is the ADHD as a superpower, or people with ADHD are superheroes. And I say, have you ever watched a superhero movie? Those folks are not the happiest souls. So the model I put forth is strengths-based, challenge aware. So I really want people to start with this idea of strengths, to learn the many strengths that ADHDers have, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about today, and to know that there are immense challenges that we face. So, society disables us, but also just sometimes even doing the things that we love and enjoy to do for folks with ADHD is incredibly challenging. So that balanced approach, not a deficit-based approach, not making us into superheroes, both of which can dehumanize us, but just honoring us as part of the vast variety and meeting us in that place. So why do those old ways of thinking about ADHD persist? The argument that I make is because it's, this is sort of like Capitalism 101 playbook. In order to deny people resources, we frame them as weak, both weak and threatening. And then we get to deny them resources. So when I think about particularly, in the past year, conversations we're seeing in the media and from elected officials about ADHD, I am increasingly aware of how threatening folks with this neurotype are to the status quo, which, the frames that we're seeing, the deficit-based frames, the fixing and saving frames, finding a cure for certain diagnoses. It's very, very apparent to me the why is that we are a threat to the status quo. We think outside of the box. We diverge from the norm. We dream and create and build better and brighter worlds for all humans. And certainly that is obviously a threat to certain folks in positions of power. So that's the why these things persist, and there's a lot of nuance to the why. There's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of internalized ableism, but for me, that's the root. And then from there, the implications in the classroom are that, students are not going to sort of live up to low expectations. The expectations that we have for our students in our classroom, believing in their capability as educators is perhaps, I think, having taught for 20 years, one of the most important things that we can bring into the classroom. If you do not believe in your students' capability, all of the practical pedagogies that you bring into the classroom sort of start to disintegrate. So it's really important that we see all of our students for who they are and for their assets. And in particular, ADHD is something we've been taught is a weakness and a deficit. So when we treat these students as a burden, if we say, I've got to deal with this student with ADHD, we're not only doing harm to that student, but we're missing out on, I call ADHDers, we're sort of like little sparks of engagement, little fireworks of engagement in the classroom. And we're missing out on that as educators, and our other students are missing out on that as well. So getting our mindset right in order to support our ADHD students and then designing practical strategies from that reframed mindset is the goal of the book.
Thank you so much for that overview. I was going to say, I think that you hit the nail on the head, so to speak, in meeting your goals, because I learned a lot through reading the book and also spent a lot of time thinking, and this is not something that was new, but I am grateful to have been reminded, and I feel like I get reminders of this every day, but they come from different entry points, about how our institutions and our classrooms are structured really for one kind of learning. right?
Yeah.
And we spend a lot of time, we in Centers for Teaching and Learning and instructors spend a lot of time trying to either mitigate those structures through things like active learning or inclusive teaching strategies, or accommodations from offices who do great work on campuses like disability, student services, et cetera, et cetera. But some of these can still come from a deficit mindset, I think. And the reframing is key. And one of the pieces of reframing, if you'll allow me to quote you, that I found really, really interesting is this discussion of divergence in your book and divergent thinking, which I have always seen as a real asset in the classroom. It's like divergent thinking and critical thinking go hand in hand. And we want to teach students how to have, I think in any discipline, like how to ask good questions and how to have new ideas and how to see things from new perspectives. Otherwise, why do we have students? Why do we have faculty? If we're just replicating the same thing over and over again. And you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but you seem to think similarly. And you say, and I'll read this for our listeners at home so that they can benefit from it too. Take a minute to think about your teaching. Are you here to get students to work within preset parameters or to think outside of those pre-existing parameters? In other words, is your work in education dedicated to upholding the status quo or expanding beyond it? And it's such a good opportunity to reflect, because I do think that most folks would say, oh, I want to expand, right? And they want students to expand, right? But then sometimes faced with the structures that we're trying to work within, it can be really hard. Like you get an assignment. I can't tell you the number of times I got an assignment back as a student that said like, great paper, not the assignment. Or this is not the question that we were, like when things don't fit. And I have unfortunately had done something similar myself as an instructor. And sometimes perhaps it is necessary and you can work with the student, but other times I sort of think like, maybe the way that student approached the assignment was okay. It's just not what I was expecting, and I didn't know how to respond. And that created a little bit of reflection for me and some empathy for instructors who might be like, yes, I want to have this expanding pedagogical position in a classroom, and yet don't know what to do when I get back an assignment or an answer to a question that I never saw coming, which is to be celebrated and also might cause some anxiety. And then you don't know what to do. So what advice might you have for those instructors, Karen? Or what do you think about this sort of situation that one might find themselves in?
Yeah, I'm calling to mind a story I tell in the book about an educator I was working with who posed a question to a group, and the assignment they were working with said something like, identify 3 causes of X, Y, or Z. And the student had done something like identified 5. And the instructor said, should I dock points for this? She was coming to her community to ask for advice. And I just thought like, oh, like we've lost the thread here, folks, right? And this is not to blame that educator, but I think that speaks to a lot of things. I think it speaks to things like faculty course loads and class sizes and the immense and constant demands for us to not just, do something a little different, like try a new announcement or, try a new lesson, but to really, in some ways, like completely redesign our entire courses and, revamp our entire teaching philosophy, which we've seen play out at least, a couple times by my count in the past 5 years with COVID lockdowns and now with artificial intelligence. So I think that when we see these sort of large scale, what I would call sort of collective traumas and transformational shifts, it's very reasonable to feel that fear of what can I control and how can I sort of tighten things up and lock things down. And I only asked for 3 answers and the student gave 5. Isn't that wrong? Like we can see where that would come from, because that at least might feel like it's somewhat in our control when so little is. I want to say to those educators who feel a little bit nervous about welcoming divergent thinking into the classroom, that's very human of you. That's very human of you. And it's very human of you to want to sort of tighten things up and lock things down and to lean on control. I'm seeing a lot of posts related to artificial intelligence that are control on steroids. Just teachers who, I won't name any names, but educators who are saying, I'm just locking this whole thing down. I'm going in the complete opposite direction. Everything is going to be so regulated. And I'm just like, whoa, right? But understand that they're seeking some certainty in a time when there feels like there is so little. So this is emotional work, being an educator, increasingly so. So I want to normalize that. The second thing I would do is, if and when you feel ready to bring some divergent thinking into your classroom, is to think about just playing with a little bit of choice in your assignments. Yes, there are the students who just go completely off the rails of the assignment and go in very directions that might happen. But we can also structure and invite that in a way that is somewhat controlled to balance our needs with the needs of our students. So for example, one of the courses I'm teaching this term is called Climate Justice Leadership. I give students a choice. They work on a hypothetical scenario throughout the term. Option 1 is they imagine that they work at a climate nonprofit. Option 2 is they imagine that they work at a climate grassroots. So the first is I'm working in the system. The second is I want to work outside of the system and get outside of that status quo. They split about half and half. Students choose option 1 and option 2. The first requires them to write a research brief, which is more writing heavy. The second requires them to design a website. So in a very simple way, there's 2 choices. There's not 17, because that's not good for me, and it's not good for my students. There's 2 choices, and they go in different directions that honor the different needs of the students. So think about how you might structure an assignment to offer up 2 choices that touch on sort of different energies that students might bring to the class. You could see how writing a research brief would be very well aligned with a certain type of thinking and working, and designing a website would be a little bit more creative and playful and visual. So I'm trying to meet the needs of those 2 types of thinkers and learners, and meeting my own needs. And the last thing I would say is that I can't think of anything worse than grading, 20 or 30 of the exact same version, a slightly different version of a submission. So just remember, human brains, whether you're ADHD or not, we do enjoy this sweet mix of novelty and structure. We need some of both. And when you don't invite divergent thinking into your classroom, you don't have enough novelty for your students, but also for yourself. So just think about, what would it look like for me as an educator to bring a little bit more novelty into my class within constraints and within structure for the good of students and for my own attention and interest in learning. And just open up to that in the slightest way, maybe 2 choices, and start there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This idea of novelty, and I think you used the word playful, it just can open up to like certain levels of comfort in the classroom, like even for students who fit narrowly within our, like, here's what it looks like to pay attention in class. All of a sudden, like, this work can be fun in a different kind of way. And we model that playfulness, I think, sometimes for our students, of like, ostensibly, many of us got into our home disciplines because we loved the work. We enjoyed the work. We found it fun. And I think sharing that has all kinds of positive impacts for our students.
Absolutely.
And does this really great work of allowing multiple entry points into demonstrating knowledge and offering alternate ways to complete assignments, which we know is great for students regardless. But I do want to reemphasize something that you said, which is like having 1 or 2 options. It doesn't have to be like, complete this assignment however you'd like to, but rather like, here are
Correct.
2 options for you, because you still have to be responsible, or we as instructors have to be responsible to make sure that this is a way for students to demonstrate their learning in the things that we're doing, right?
And a ton of options is not good for ADHDers either. I talk in the book about being ABD all but dissertation, and how I changed my dissertation topic 900 times. I was undiagnosed at the time. It would have been helpful to know, but we would change our topic every hour if we could, and that is one of the beautiful parts of our brain, and that variety and ability to come up with so many ideas is a huge asset. and we got to help the ADHDers land the plane. We don't want to leave them circling up there. So we give them that flexibility within structure. Constraints are not a barrier to creativity. Speak to any painter or ceramic artist or visual artist, and they will say that constraints are an incredibly important part of their creative practice. So don't think that putting constraints on an assignment is blocking out creativity. It can often sort of lead students to the next step in their creative process. So 2 choices is a great place to start. 3 maybe down the road at some point, but more than that, you're going to start getting into a sense of overwhelm that is not going to benefit your ADHDers.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. This is a great transition to another question or something else that I really loved in your book, which of course inspired questions, which is when you get into the teaching strategies, and I know we're sort of talking about some of those now, you invite your readers to play the game of small, which is, I really loved that turn of phrase, and invited folks to ask, like, what are 1 or 2 things that you can do next term to create more inclusive classrooms, right? So you don't have to overhaul everything that you've ever done. You can just pick 1 or 2 things, and it makes change seem possible. It makes moving the needle seem doable. And I'm just curious. So we've been talking about, offer perhaps 2 ways to complete an assignment. Could you share 1 or 2 things that you can imagine instructors could do to make their classrooms more welcoming to students with ADHD? And then, of course, we'll send everybody to your book to see other ones.
Sure. Yeah, play the game of small. I want to give a hat tip to someone who I consider one of my greatest teachers, Adrienne Marie Brown, and her work in emergent strategy. So if this idea of small is all resonates with you, that comes from Adrienne Marie Brown and has been keeping me as grounded as possible since I read it, I think in 2021. And within the first 2 pages, it just felt like a deep sigh of relief as I was reading it. So highly recommend Adrienne Marie Brown's books. She does tons of work. So yeah, I think the first thing I want to say, and I talk about this in the book, is on the topic of shame. And 2 of the doctors who I cite a ton in the book, Doctors Hollowell and Dr. Rady, wrote a book called ADHD 2.0. They've written a bunch of books. They are medical doctors who both also have ADHD. And that combination of their medical experience with their lived experience has been very important to me. Dr. Hollowell in particular is somebody who I hold dear in my heart because his TikTok videos were one of the first things I saw when I was diagnosed. And he would start them by saying, people with ADHD, people like me. And then he would share some tip. And when I heard this medical doctor saying, people with ADHD, people like me, something would start to heal in me. And Hollowell and Rady talk about shame as the most debilitating part of any learning disability. And we know about something called rejection-sensitive dysphoria, where ADHDers have a sort of total body reaction to criticism, and even feedback that is intended to be positive is often incredibly hurtful. We are incredibly sensitive to feedback. So one of the things you can do is perhaps share with your students that you listened to this podcast and that you learned something about ADHD and that you heard someone speaking, someone who's an author, who is an adjunct professor in higher education, and she was talking about how to help learners with ADHD. I did not have one college professor. I don't know. I'm not going to count how many years I was in higher ed, but a lot. I don't have, in any K through 12 or higher ed, not one of my educators ever said I have ADHD. Many, I would assume, based on we ADHDers do end up quite a bit in higher ed, did have ADHD, didn't know it, or maybe didn't feel comfortable in sharing it because of the stigma. But the reality is that meant that students like me did not have any ADHD role models. So it's really important to me to talk about this and to talk about it with my students. Whether or not you have ADHD as a professor, you can say, I listened to this podcast because I want to learn more about ADHD and the many strengths of ADHDers and the challenges. And I am committed to educating myself to celebrate your strengths and to support you with your challenges. So that is shame reduction. And that is often, I think, the most difficult part of living with ADHD. So anything you can do as an educator to reduce shame in your classroom is really important. And the second thing is a little more practical, task lists. I was thinking about this earlier today. I don't know why, I don't know why this very simple strategy is not just canon in higher ed, but it's not even close. So we do a terrible job in general of providing very simple task lists with connection to due dates for our classes. And we do a very terrible job of explaining that to students across their classes. Many students are taking 4 or 5 classes a term. Our learning management systems, whether students are taking online classes or not, do a terrible job at communicating that to students in a way that is accessible for them. So a very simple thing that I will do for my students is create in Google Docs. It takes me less than 15 minutes, is I created a task list of all of the graded assignments in the course and the dates that they are due with a little checkbox so that they can check it off, whether they print it out or use it in Google Docs. And I create a monthly calendar for them where they can see when those are due. The final trick is to know and work with students to understand due dates versus due dates. So due dates, DUE, are when the assignment is due. And we make that known to students, but we do very little to help students identify the due date, DO. So when I am working with ADHD students, I do this for all my students, but especially with ADHDers and any student who's struggling and trying to catch up in a class, I'm constantly coaching them on those DO dates. So if this is due on Friday, what's your plan for when you're going to DO it, right? You can't, if it's due Friday at 11:59 p.m., you can't DO it Friday at 11:59 p.m. You can try, but it's probably not going to work out so well. And those task lists and calendars could so easily, and can so easily, if you provide this for students, help them identify those due dates. To me, the dream is that this would be woven into our courses, this would be structural, this would be in our learning management systems, and this would be how we do business. I work in systems thinking in part, so we talk about leverage points as the smallest possible action that will have the biggest possible impact. And I think this is just like so low risk, so high benefit, so, very not labor intensive, and this could be hugely transformative for all students, but particularly for ADHD students to help them get as close to those deadlines as they can and successfully complete our courses. So if you don't have that at your institution, I would love to see it be institution-wide, but set up a quick task list for your students and give them that visual that they can check off, and it will be incredibly helpful.
Karen, I can remember working with students and have worked with students and thought, and this is years ago, and thought like, it is the time management that is the issue here. Like I can see, like for whatever reason, quite possibly ADHD, not being able to break down the component pieces of a course or an assignment, or the way I had framed it was not working with their brain because it came out of my brain. And I have often worked at an individual level with a student to say, like, let's break down these task lists. Let's create task lists. Let's figure out the DO versus the DUE dates.
Yep.
Offering it to your entire class, why not? Why wouldn't you? Like, what a wonderful idea. And you're right. It does not take a ton of time and could be really meaningful for all of your students, but especially ones who might be struggling with breaking down those component pieces. Is that what it comes down to?
Yeah, we ADHDers, that's a huge struggle for us, is breaking down things and, priority-based type of thinking. We are much more interest-based type of thinkers. So making that external is really important. Our brains, we have what I am calling lately a porous working memory. So think of sort of the ADHD working memory as like a strainer or colander versus a pot. So things are just sort of flowing through there, which is probably the neurological basis for our massively strong creativity and divergent thinking. But it means that we're not able to sort of think like, okay, I have this paper due on this day, and let me, in my mind, work backwards from that, and I'm going to do it on this day, and then I need to go to the library, and then I need to do this interview. It's like that in one ear, out the other. So by the time we have the first thought, it goes away, and then we can't hold on to that to work with it with the second thought and the third. So putting it in writing, making it external, which is an entire chapter in the book, allows us, ideally with, at least at first, a trusted guide or coach or our educator can help us. We don't have to hold it in our mind when we put it on paper. And then we can break down the tasks associated with the assignment, assign dates to them, and then set up a system for how we're going to remind ourselves and stay on track. So yeah, we don't do that breakdown. That doesn't come naturally to us. So we need some external scaffolding in order to get that done.
The process of making the invisible work visible there, I think, would be an extraordinary move for students with ADHD, but especially if it came from an instructor who, as you mentioned previously, has shared with students that they are committed to understanding ADHD and that they're working on it and they listen to this podcast and it's something that they've committed to educating themselves about. I can imagine that that could be transformative for a student in a class.
I mean, I just got the chills thinking about all the messages we get in this world about ADHD that are still so deficit-based, and to hear from one of your professors, like, I am learning about this and I see your strengths and I am dedicated to learning more so I can support you in bringing those strengths out into the world. And I know that this is often a challenge and I'm going to educate myself about support. That's something that is so incredibly rare. And, I talk in the book and elsewhere about mutualism, which is the place where there's shared benefit between students and educators, and that's going to do good for your students, but it's also going to feel really good for you because it's going to land and it's going to help your students, and that feels good. It feels good to help other people. Yeah, I think that would be those two simple strategies. And, again, play the game of small. If either one of those feels overwhelming, you say to yourself, then how can I make it smaller? And you can keep going down. It can be microscopic whenever y'all are listening to this. Sometimes it's got to be real small, our efforts to make some positive change in the day. But small is all, Adrienne Marie Brown says, and that is forward motion and forward progress. So make it as small as you need to make it feel possible for you, and trust that it is still making a shift in the system.
I can't think of a better way to end our conversation, Karen. It has been such a delight to talk with you today about this. I think everybody should read your book. And I am so grateful in your participation in our 11th season of Dead Ideas.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's a huge achievement. And thank you so much for having me.
Hi, I'm Lauren Close, the Senior Communications and Outreach Manager at Columbia University's Center for Teaching and Learning. If you enjoyed this episode of the Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning podcast, please visit our website where you can find a transcript and links to all the resources we mentioned. We're at ctl.columbia.edu/podcast. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. This really helps us reach new listeners. Dead Ideas is hosted by Amanda Irvin and produced by Stephanie Ogden, Sarah Carswell, Lauren Close, and Michael Brown. Our theme music is In the Lab by Immersive Music. See you next time.